There are known knowns, known unknowns, and unknown unknowns. But there are also unknown knowns. The ancient and esoteric order of the Jackalope is a secret society devoted to unearthing and sharing this forgotten knowledge. Each episode, we take one of these strange stories and share it with you. No topic is off limits, except for the obvious. Greetings, initiates. Number 13 here, coming to you from deep beneath Lodge number 777. It's spring now, when a young man's fancy turns to escaping the podcasting bunker he's been stuck in for 2 years and going outside. Maybe even getting on his bike and going for a ride. After recording, I suppose. As you may have heard last episode, we are now a member of That's Not Canon Productions, a podcast network for independent podcasters. And with that comes a great responsibility, promoting our fellows by playing a random promo from this bag of cassettes the Grand Jackalope sent me. Shall we?
We're the Curiosity of a Child podcast.
I'm Anton, the son.
And I'm the daddy.
I'm the daddy.
And we're curious about
Everything.
We're a podcast about history, science, storytelling, and
The curiosity of a child.
we like to dig into different topics, everything from the humble ox
In that episode, I had to learn about castration,
to the most popular Christmas toys of yesteryear.
including a doll that could bite your fingers off and a pet rock.
We don't just talk though, we like to experience. That might mean recording on location in a 5,000-year-old dolmen full of spiders and reportedly the entrance to the furry realm.
Or simply tasting spices from across the world.
We also recreated and ate various forms of corpse medicine, such as human brain, mellified man.
And a nice warm glass of urine. Yum.
Listen to the
Curiosity of a Child podcast.
Oh nice, I'll have to add that one to the list. This week, initiates, we've got quite a tale to tell about a time when Northmen crossed the icy seas and settled on a strange new land on the edge of the known world. No, don't change the channel. This isn't like last time. This will be a lot shorter. And there is an actual colony involved, I swear. Before we start, a quick apologies to the Swedish, the Finns, the Dutch, and the Lenape, because I am going to absolutely butcher the pronunciation of your beautiful languages. All joking aside, if anyone wants to waste their time and teach me the proper pronunciations, I'm all game. That's jackalope@orderofthejackalope.com. Nya Sverige, presented by number 13. When you think of early colonial America, you think of great European powers battling it out for dominance, like the French, Spanish, English, and Dutch. But what about the Swedish? It may seem hard to believe today, but for 2 decades the Swedes were right there in the thick of things, the first real settlers of what is now Delaware. At the time, the area was essentially unclaimed. By the 1620s, the English had control of everything south and west of Chesapeake Bay, and the Dutch had control of everything north and east of Delaware Bay. Sandwiched between the two colonies, you've had the Delmarva Peninsula, which functioned as a sort of no man's land. I mean, as long as you don't count all the Native Americans who were living there. The Dutch did make one attempt to expand into the area. In 1629, they granted a patroonship on the western side of the Delaware Bay to the village of Zwanendal. However, the colonists did not get along well with the nearby Native American tribes, which you can tell by the way that the Native Americans killed every last one of them and then burned the village to the ground. After that, the Dutch understandably decided to forget about settlement and instead focused on trading with the local Nanticokes and Susquehannock. The idea of starting a Swedish colony in Delaware actually came from the Dutch. William Uselink, one of the founders of the Dutch West India Company, became convinced that the company's operations were too small and unambitious in scale, and that they were leaving money on the table. So he went to the King of Sweden, Gustavus Adolphus, and suggested that the Swedes could start a competing colony and outdo the Dutch. He confidently predicted that after a few years, a Swedish colony would generate the staggering annual return of some 30 million riksdaler. Gustavus Adolphus was intrigued. That was a lot of money. Plus, an overseas colony would not only establish Sweden as a force to be reckoned with, it would let him add emperor to his list of titles. On June 14, 1629, the king gave his seal of approval to the Swedish South Company, with Uselink as its head. Unfortunately, while Uselink had a great idea, his timing was awful. The ink was barely dry on the contract before hostilities resumed in Sweden's ongoing war with Poland, and then dealing with that got the country sucked into the larger 30 Years' War. The king and his ministers were understandably distracted by the fact that Europe was in flames, and Uselink was understandably distracted because most of his investments were also in flames. The death of Gustavus Adolphus in 1632 was the final nail in the coffin for the whole enterprise. The Swedish South Company was disbanded. In 1636, the idea of a colony was raised again by another disgruntled officer of the Dutch West India Company, Samuel Blumart. Blumart was gung-ho for the idea for several reasons. First, he was an investor in the company that owned the patroonship near Zwanendal, which he would be happy to sell to the Swedish for a tidy profit. And it would also give him a way to bring goods into Sweden on ships flying a Swedish flag, allowing him to avoid tariffs. Naked self-interest aside, Blumart made some good points. He was able to convince Queen Christina, or rather her regent and Lord High Chancellor Count Axel Oxenstierna, to greenlight a second venture, Nya Sverige, New Sweden. A formal corporation was chartered, the New Sweden Company, which brought aboard a third disgruntled West India Company guy, one with practical, boots-on-the-ground experience setting up a colony, Peter Minuit. You know, the guy who purchased Manhattan Island from the Canarsie for $24 worth of beads. Minuit would be the colony's governor. The Swedes and their Dutch partners raised some 24,000 florins, which they used to purchase ammunition, provisions, and trade goods, recruit about 24 soldiers to be the first colonists, and outfit 2 ships, the Kalmar Nickel and Fogelgrip. In November 1637, the 2 ships set out from Gothenburg for the New World. Well, at least that was the idea. Only a few days out they were damaged in a storm and had to get repaired in the Netherlands. They finally managed to set sail some 6 weeks later at the end of the year. The Kalmar Nickel and Fogelgrip arrived in the New World in late March 1638. The ships landed on a spot near the banks of the Mispillion River, which they called Paradise Point, but which is today called Slaughter Beach. The name either comes from a local postmaster, a Native American massacre, or the number of dead crabs that wash up at high tide. Then they went looking for the locals. On March 29th, they finally found some. On the banks of the Christiana River, near modern-day Wilmington, they encountered a band of Lenape, and Minuit managed to talk his way into a meeting with their chief, Matti. After a hard day's negotiation, Minuit walked away with a treaty that gave him the rights to all the land on the shores of the Delaware, from Cape Henlopen in the south all the way up to the falls of the Delaware by Trenton. Then he gathered his men and started building an armed camp, Fort Christina. Now, Minuit was supposed to be keeping his expedition on the down low, but he destroyed any chance of secrecy almost immediately. First by sending men up the Delaware River and right past the Dutch outpost of Fort Nassau, near modern-day Gloucester, New Jersey, and then by sending the Fogelgrip to Jamestown to trade for tobacco. This resulted in some sternly worded complaints from William Berkeley, the governor of Virginia, and Willem Kieft, the director general of New Netherland. Minuit paid no attention to their protests. Oxenstierna had already convinced the English crown to renounce its claims to Delaware, and while the Dutch talked a good game, they were stretched so thin they had no way of backing their words up. By July, Phase 1 of the plan was complete. Minuit placed the colony in the hands of his trusted lieutenant Mons Nilsen Kling and set off on the Kalmar Nickel to return to Sweden and prepare for the following year's voyage. There was time to spare, so first he dropped by the Caribbean to take care of some personal business. While visiting St. Kitts in August, he encountered a ship owned by a friend, Het Vliegende Hert, and went on board for a visit. Then a hurricane came out of nowhere. Het Vliegende Hert was washed out to sea and was never seen again, with Peter Minuit still on board. The Kalmar Nickel somehow managed to weather the storm and slowly made its way back to Gothenburg, where it delivered the sad news that the governor of New Sweden, the only officer of the New Sweden Company with any practical experience, had been lost at sea. At this point, the Dutch began to have doubts about the colony's chance for success. Fortunately for them, the Swedes began to think that for nationalistic and patriotic reasons, the colony should be a purely Swedish affair. The Dutch were able to leverage this into generous buyouts and several years' worth of consulting fees. The Swedes then proceeded to show the Dutch why they were right to worry. The company took over a year to outfit the Kalmar Nickel for a second expedition. Then the ship's new captain, Cornelius van Vliet, proved to be incompetent and tyrannical, and his crew mutinied. That took a few months to sort out, and as a result the return voyage wound up being delayed all the way until February 1640. This second group of colonists consisted mostly of soldiers, but not loyal soldiers like the first group. These were deserters offered a choice between becoming colonists or swinging at the end of a rope. It also included the colony's first pastor, Rioris Torkillus, and Fort Christina's new commander, Lieutenant Peter Hollander Ritter. The ships arrived in the New World on April 17th. Just in the nick of time, too. Kling and the 24 soldiers left behind by Minuit had been busy, clearing the land around the fort and competing with the Dutch in the fur trade. They hadn't actually managed to make a dent in Dutch operations, but they had frustrated them by driving up prices. After 2 years with no word from home, though, their resolve had begun to waver, and they were on the verge of deserting when the Kalmar Nickel sailed over the horizon. Over the coming months, Commandant Ritter made some additional land purchases from the Lenape, exchanged a few shots with the Dutch at Fort Nassau, and expanded Fort Christina. And that's about it. At this point in his naval career, Ritter was very much a junior officer, capable of tactically executing someone else's plan, but incapable of creating a long-term strategy on his own. Though, even if he had been a strategist, he would have had trouble finding the resources and personnel necessary to execute those plans.
I am supposed to supervise the people doing the work, but you must send carpenters and people with the trade. It has been somewhat overlooked that we don't even have a single man here that can build a hovel-like peasant house, or saw board, nor is there anyone who knows how to work in the field or do farm work. In general, one cannot do much with these people. In all of Sweden there are no dumber and coarser people than the ones that are here now.
Ritter's prayers were answered when the Kalmar Nickel arrived in November 1641 with a third group of colonists. This time, they were not deserters, but farmers, most of them Finns. In the late 16th and early 17th century, the Finns had been instrumental in ramping up Swedish agriculture, enabling the kingdom to transform itself into a major economic power. But as the country's economy shifted from agriculture to mining and shipbuilding, the slash-and-burn agriculture practiced by the Finns, and the resulting out-of-control forest fires, had become a major nuisance. As a result, they were encouraged to migrate to New Sweden, where they wouldn't bother anyone. Once in the New World, the Finns attacked the forest around Fort Christina with gusto, clearing vast swaths of land and planting wheat, rye, maize, and tobacco. Within a few months, the place was finally starting to look like a real colony. Not that Ritter would get to enjoy it for long. On February 16, 1643, 2 ships arrived from Sweden, the Fama and Svenen, bringing with them everything a growing colony needs: supplies, trade goods, 30 fresh soldiers, a trumpeter and drummer, a clerk, barber, and hangman. And more Swedish farmers and forest-destroying Finns, too, but obviously those are less important to the functioning of a colony than, say, a military band and a hangman. The 2 ships also brought with them the newly appointed governor of New Sweden, Lieutenant Colonel Johan Bjornsson Prince. Prince had been a loyal and capable soldier in the army of Gustavus Adolphus during the 30 Years' War, but had been court-martialed in 1640 for surrendering the besieged Saxon city of Chemnitz. By 1642, he was either back in royal favor and rewarded with the post of governor, still in the doghouse and given the post of governor as a punishment, or possibly just the only person in Sweden who actually wanted the job. In some ways, Prince was a larger-than-life character. Literally, he was over 6 feet tall and 400 pounds, all of it muscle. Imagine King Kong Bundy dressed like a Shakespearean actor, and you're halfway there. He ate more than any other man in the colony and drank like a fish. He was the largest person the Lenape had ever seen, and they semi-affectionately called him Big Belly or Big Tub. He was coarse and direct, and used to getting things done his way. Prince's first order of business was protecting the colony from other Europeans. Step 1 was following up a suggestion from Ritter that the colony would be better served by a fort further upstream where the river was narrower. The new governor quickly found the ideal spot: Tinicum, a small island where Darby Creek emptied into the Delaware, right past the runways of the Philadelphia International Airport. His Fort Gothenburg was far more impressive than Fort Christina had ever been. It had solid stone walls, numerous storehouses, even a 2-story mansion called the Princehof for the governor to live in. The next step was putting the Dutch in their place. Prince built a third Fort Elfsborg across the river near modern-day Salem, New Jersey. Thanks to the 8 cannon at Fort Elfsborg and the 4 at Fort Gothenburg, the Swedes now had complete control over the Delaware below the falls. His men used their firepower to interdict Dutch trading vessels, confiscating any tobacco and beaver pelts they found, since the Swedes claimed a royal monopoly on both products. The forts also prevented the Dutch from easily reinforcing Fort Nassau by sea. The final step was getting rid of the English. In 1641, some colonists from New Haven had purchased land on both sides of the river from the Lenape. They had tried to settle in New Jersey, but had been driven out by the Dutch, and then resettled on the other side of the river near the Schuylkill. The Yankees were enterprising and industrious, but initiative and industry are no match for cannon. Prince arrested their leaders, tried them on charges of beaver smuggling and stirring up unrest among the natives, and sent them back to Connecticut in irons. With the safety of New Sweden now secured, Prince could finally turn to making the colony profitable. Minuit and Ritter had only managed to raise the price the Dutch had paid for beaver pelts. Prince, on the other hand, actually had the resources to meet those prices, and did. his aggressive purchasing strategy almost drove the Dutch completely out of the market. Prince also ordered the colony's farmers to stop planting subsistence crops and start planting cash crops, i.e., tobacco. This quickly proved to be a mistake. The winter of 1643-44 was harsh and bitterly cold, and 25 colonists died of starvation and malnutrition. The rest survived by trading what little they had left to the Lenape for corn. When the Fama returned with more supplies and settlers in the spring of 1644, it found the colonists working hard and in good spirits. It sailed off in June with a cargo of some 2,000 beaver pelts and 20,000 tons of tobacco. That sounds really impressive for a few months' work, until you realize that the beaver pelts had been purchased from the Lenape at inflated prices, and the tobacco from Virginia at even more inflated prices. It gets worse. Most of that cargo didn't even make it back to Sweden. On the journey to Gothenburg, the Fama had to make an emergency stop in a Dutch-controlled port, and the vengeful Dutch taxed the hell out of its cargo. Prince's first year set the tone for the rest of his governorship, and things quickly settled into a predictable pattern. The Dutch would build new trading posts, and Prince would build newer trading posts that broke their supply lines. The Dutch would buy land from the Lenape, and Prince would question the legitimacy of the purchase and have boundary markers torn down. The Finns cleared the forest away at an amazingly quick pace, and the Swedes followed behind building houses, barns, mills, even churches. Then the land was planted with tobacco at the expense of everything else, and come winter the colonists would have to survive by eating their seed corn. Contact with Sweden was non-existent, leading Prince and the other colonists to wonder whether they'd been abandoned by their queen. That silence was finally broken on October 1st, 1646, when the Gyllen Hagen limped into port. It was several months behind schedule, having lost its sails, topmasts, a good chunk of its cargo, and several crewmen to bad weather and illness. The ship was trapped in the colony over the winter, but set sail for Sweden on February 20th of the following year. Their cargo included some 24,000 pounds of tobacco, as usual most of it purchased from Virginia. Sven Vass, a soldier who had fallen asleep on watch and accidentally burned down large chunks of Fort Gothenburg, who was being sent home to be court-martialed. And a status report from Governor Johan Prince to Count Axel Oxenstierna. Prince led off with the good news. The new Sweden colony had great potential. It was full of exploitable natural resources, though maybe not the gold and silver they had hoped for. Relations with the Native Americans were good. The colonists had recovered from the harsh winters and now numbered 183 people, and everyone was as happy as could possibly be under the circumstances. And then he started in with the complaints. Boy, did he have a lot of complaints.
Concerning trade, in the year 1644, when the ship Fama was sent from here, there was very little of the cargo left in store, and as no cargo has been received since, not only has the Right Honourable Company suffered the great damage of losing 8,000 or 9,000 beavers which have passed out of our hands, but also the Hollanders have moved the principal traders to forsake us, and we shall not without great difficulty regain them. Again, we want a good engineer, house carpenter, mason, brickmaker, potter, cooper, skillful gunsmiths and blacksmiths, a chamois dresser, tanner, tailor, shoemaker, rope maker, wheelwright and executioner. All of these are of great necessity here, and above all, a good number of unmarried women for our unmarried freemen and others, besides a good many families for cultivating the land, able officers and soldiers, as well as cannon and ammunition for the defense of the forts in the country. As before stated, the officers, as well as the common soldiers not yet settled in the country, want to be released, particularly Commissary Hindrek Hugen, who I myself now, for the third time, have with great difficulty persuaded to stay until the arrival of the next ship. He ought to be replaced by a very able commissary. Again, the Minister Magister Johan Campanius wishes to be dismissed, and we want at least 2 clergymen in the places already settled. The freemen already settled want to be paid the rest of their wages, and whereas their intention is to continue to cultivate the land with that money, I think it advisable to pay them for the good of the country, and as an example for others. Again, I humbly repeat the 18th point of my last report, reporting how I for a great while, about 28 years, have been in the service of my dear native country, constantly accompanying her armies to the field, and now have served in New Sweden 1 year and 7 months beyond the time agreed upon, ordering everything so that Her Royal Majesty has obtained a strong footing in this land, and that means the work does not require anything but sufficient means to be continued with greater success.
Note how little has changed from Ritter's complaints in years previous. There's still a total lack of direction and material from the Swedish government, complaints about the lack of skilled tradesmen, and grumbling from men who want to be sent home. Prince only had to wait a year to see if his message had been received. The Svanen arrived in early 1648, bringing with it more trade goods, colonists, and Oxenstierna's reply, which was disappointing to say the least. Instead of giving direct orders or strategic advice, Oxenstierna basically told Prince to figure it out on his own. Everyone who wanted to leave was given a raise to encourage them to stay, because giving someone who hasn't been paid a raise is such an effective strategy. To be fair to Oxenstierna, he had a lot of things on his plate at the time. He was negotiating the Peace of Westphalia through his son Eric, and was also butting heads with Queen Christina, who was trying to get him to retire. The troubles of New Sweden were way down on his priority list. Still, the reply had to be somewhat dispiriting to Prince, who was trapped in a strange land with no real direction from above. So the colony remained locked in the same old pattern for the next several years. This did not go over well with the soldiers and other colonists. They had no idea what was going on back in Sweden. They only knew that they weren't getting the material support, personnel, or wages they were promised. Consequently, they took their frustrations out on the only available authority figure, Prince. They called him a taskmaster, a disciplinarian, a petty tyrant. He was all of these things, of course. You don't get to be governor without him, but the irony was that Prince sympathized with, even agreed with, all of their complaints, but was obliged to punish anyone who complained. Things only got worse when the next supply ship, the Catan, shrunk off the coast of Puerto Rico in August 1649, losing most of its crew and passengers and all of its cargo of weapons and trade goods. The colonists of New Sweden wouldn't even learn about the wreck for another year, and only then from the Dutch and English. The colonists began to worry that they had been abandoned by the mother country. In some sense, they were right. After the loss of the Catan, the Swedish crown would not send another ship to their all-but-forgotten colony for almost 4 years. While the Swedes were neglecting their colony, the Dutch were showing a renewed interest in theirs. Peter Stuyvesant took over as the Director General of New Netherland in 1647 and started to whip the colony into shape. By 1649, he felt emboldened enough to make moves against New Sweden. Previous Director Generals had not made aggressive moves against the Swedes because their resources in Delaware were spread thin, and the small colony made for a useful buffer against the English in Virginia. Stuyvesant, though, felt that its usefulness had come to an end, and its virtual abandonment by the motherland meant it would be easy pickings. When the Swedes threatened Dutch trading posts, Stuyvesant sent West India Company representatives armed with copies of treaties and deeds to argue that the Dutch had purchased the land first. When Prince rejected those arguments, the Dutch sold arms to the Native Americans and encouraged them to use them against the Swedes. In 1651, Stuyvesant made a baller move. In May, a Dutch man-o-war tried to sail past Fort Elfsborg, but was driven back out to sea by a cannonade. On June 25th, the man-o-war returned, this time personally commanded by Stuyvesant. He also brought 10 smaller ships and 150 soldiers as backup. This time they sailed past Fort Elfsborg unmolested. Stuyvesant sailed past Tinicum, hoisted a middle finger to Governor Prince, and resupplied the long-suffering Fort Nassau. Then he purchased more land from the Lenape. There was plenty to be had. For all their industriousness, the Swedes had only managed to clear and cultivate some 36 hectares. Then Stuyvesant sailed back down the river and broke ground for a new fort on the western banks of the Delaware, near modern-day Newcastle. To get to this Fort Casimir, one still had to sail past Fort Elfsborg, but it was positioned before Fort Christina and Fort Gothenburg as you went up the river. Stuyvesant had effectively split New Sweden in half. Dutch colonists began streaming into the area, undermining Swedish claims to sovereignty. In August 1652, Prince wrote about his troubles.
The Puritans threaten us with violence, and the Dutch are pressing us on all sides. They have ruined the fur trade. The savages are troubling us, having bought cargoes of strangers. The people are beginning to desert the colony in despair. 40 Dutch families have settled east of the river, who have absolutely no provision and do not sow or plough, desiring to live by the traffic with the natives, which they themselves have destroyed.
Stuyvesant's actions had finally pushed the Swedish colony to a breaking point. About half the colonists put their name on a petition decrying the governor as an ineffectual tyrant and calling for his removal, then presented it to Prince and demanded he forward it to the crown. Prince's response was direct. He executed Anders Jonsson, who he incorrectly believed to be the instigator of the whole movement. From that point on, the colony was in open revolt. There was no shooting, at least not yet, but no one had any respect for Prince's authority. Realizing that he was now alone and outnumbered, Prince got out of Dodge fast. In October 1653, he hopped on a Dutch merchantman and sailed back to Sweden with his wife and daughters, leaving his son-in-law Johann Papagoya in charge. When he finally reached Sweden, he discovered just why there had been no contact with the motherland for 6 years. Axel Oxenstierna was on his deathbed. Queen Christina was on the verge of abdicating. In the chaos, everyone had just forgotten that they had a colony. Now, its governor was standing before them, and they remembered. And they were not at all happy that he had deserted his post. Prince was replaced with a younger, more aggressive governor, Johann Claesson Riesing. Riesing, several dozen soldiers, and a large group of colonists set sail from Gothenburg in February 1654 aboard a full-fledged warship, the Ornen. The Ornen had one hell of a trip. First, it was diverted for a week when it was intercepted by a British cruiser that mistook it for a Dutch vessel. Then it had a close call with 3 Turkish slavers near the Azores. Just before it reached America, it ran into a hurricane that knocked down the masts, washed several of the crew overboard, and left it dead in the water. On May 20th, the ship limped up Delaware Bay and arrived at Fort Elfsborg, only to find it had been completely abandoned. Hardly surprising, Fort Casimir had completely cut it off from its supply lines. Riesing had standing orders to go easy on the Dutch, but if the Dutch were starving out Swedish forts, all bets were off. He sailed upriver to Fort Casimir and fired off what was euphemistically referred to as a Swedish salute. The Dutch responded with musket fire. Sensing he had the advantage, Riesing sent a small group of soldiers to negotiate the fort's surrender. While that was going on, a second group of soldiers snuck up to the fort, found a flaw in its construction, streamed inside, and overwhelmed the Dutch defenders. Riesing sent the soldiers packing, resupplied the fort with cannon from the Ornen, and rechristened it Fort Trinity, since it had been recaptured on Trinity Sunday. With the Dutch taken care of, Riesing sailed upstream to Fort Christina, only to find New Sweden in total disarray. The colonists were still sick and starving. Some of them had fled to Maryland or Virginia just to get away from Papagoya, who turned out to be more tyrannical than Prince had ever been. Others had gone over to the Dutch, and had even formally petitioned Stuyvesant to annex the colony to New Netherland. Well, Riesing was here to help. He disgorged a boatload of 200 new settlers, more than doubling the colony's population to 368. To encourage the colony to expand further inland, he declared that for several years any newly cultivated land would be free of taxation. He locked up the ringleaders of the pro-Dutch colonists and tried to lure back the colonists who'd fled with promises of amnesty. He even appealed to the convicts and deserters by capping the length of their indentured servitude to only 20 years. This is sometimes referred to as the first anti-slavery legislation in America, which is highly misleading at best. He even managed to smooth things over with the Lenape. In the short run, it kind of worked. The Ornen was able to leave 2 months later with a positive report from the governor and a holdful of tobacco. Purchased from Virginia, of course. Unlike his predecessors, Riesing had not been abandoned by the motherland. Only a few months later in September, the Gyllenhagen arrived in the colony with a fresh load of trade goods. Well, except it didn't. Its captain had somehow mistaken the Hudson River for the Delaware River and sailed straight into the heart of New Amsterdam. The Dutch captured it, stripped it of cargo, and sent it packing. The loss of the Gyllenhagen and its cargo was a devastating loss in more ways than one. The Dutch had already been planning on retaking Fort Trinity. They figured they could take their time and strike in a year or so when the Swedes were once again weak and dispirited. But the arrival of a supply ship so quickly after the previous one signaled that the Swedes were no longer going to be absentee landlords. Stuyvesant made a fateful decision. New Sweden had to go. Over the next few months, he assembled a small navy consisting of 600 men and 4 warships. The flagship was De Waag, which boasted a frightening 36 cannon and a crew of 200. On April 30th, 1655, he sailed the flotilla up the Delaware past Fort Elfsborg. The Swedish guns remained silent. Later, the gunners would claim it was because Stuyvesant's ships had struck their sails, a sign of submission, but it seems just as likely that the gunners knew they were hopelessly outnumbered and didn't want to anger their foes. Stuyvesant then landed Marines upriver and took the fort without firing a shot. His next stop was at Fort Trinity on September 1st. Sven Scoot, the commander, thought diplomacy might be possible and once again refused to fire on the Dutch. When Stuyvesant landed and started setting up siege works, Scoot realized he was outnumbered 12-1. He made one vain attempt to convince Stuyvesant to go upriver and talk with Governor Riesing. Stuyvesant replied,
Riesing did not send me word when he captured Fort Casimir, and I shall take the work if it were hung on chains.
I have no idea what this means, but it sounds badass. Apparently Scoot thought so too, and he surrendered the fort without firing a shot. Then it was upstream to Fort Christina, which was woefully unprepared despite a warning from the Lenape and the hostilities of the previous several days. Riesing did manage to get all of his people inside the fort, but none of the livestock. For several days they starved in the fort while the Dutch slaughtered their cows and goats, feasted, set up siege works, and sailed north to torch Fort Gothenburg just for kicks. Riesing made a few attempts to reason with Stuyvesant, but it was futile, and he surrendered Fort Christina on September 15th. This time, at least, shots were fired, most of them by Swedes and other Swedes trying to desert to the Dutch side. Stuyvesant offered the Swedish colonists a choice. They could accept Dutch sovereignty and be left alone to govern themselves, or they could get a free boat ride back to Europe. Riesing and about a third of the colonists took him up on his offer. The rest chose to remain. While the exiles were on their way back to Sweden, another supply ship, the Mercurius, arrived in March 1656. It was supposed to reinforce Fort Trinity and was quite shocked to learn that it had reverted to being Fort Casimir. Dutch officers turned the ship away, but it just landed out of sight of the fort and offloaded several dozen colonists. The Mercurius still had to return to Sweden with an empty hold and a sad story. And that was pretty much it. New Sweden was seamlessly folded into New Netherland. There was no real conflict, save for some internal factional squabbles between the Swedes who still had some loyalty to their home country and those who were more attached to their personal property than the Swedish crown. King Charles X was furious about the loss of the colony, and rightfully so. It made Sweden look weak and pathetic. However, conflicts in Poland, Lithuania, and Denmark took precedence, and before Charles could turn his attention back to New Sweden, he died of pneumonia. In 1663, the regents of King Charles XI decided it was time to take the colony back, and had a 32-gun warship and a smaller gunboat built for the task. West India Company officers learned of these plans and sent word to Stuyvesant, but they needn't have bothered. The gunboat sunk in a sudden storm, and the warship was reassigned to patrol the African coast. New Netherland was safe. Well, safe from the Swedish at least. In 1664, the English conquered New Netherland, and the territory was split into New York, New Jersey, and Delaware, the latter of which became the personal property of James, Duke of York. The English actively began settling the land and administered it as part of the colony of New York. This drew the ire of the Finns. They had continued to migrate to the area even after the Dutch conquest, and now made up the majority of the Swedish settlers. Most of them were argumentative, independent, and anti-government. They had been comfortable with the hands-off style of the Dutch, but were less than happy with the more intrusive governing style of the English. In 1668, a man named Königsmark arrived in Delaware under mysterious circumstances. No one knew exactly who he was or where he had come from. There were Königsmarks back in Sweden, but no one by that name had ever emigrated to America. He quickly earned the nickname the Long Finn because of his prodigious height. Königsmark traveled around the former New Sweden with a simple message, that Charles XI was finally ready to reclaim his former colony. He would gather the locals for what the English called
riotous, routus, and unlawful assemblies.
Drinking parties, basically. And when everyone was nice and wasted, he would get them to recite a loyalty oath to the Swedish crown and encourage them to take up arms against the English. It was a sentimental message that proved popular. Soon the Longfin had a group of followers that included several influential property owners, Armigot Prince, the late governor's daughter, and Minister Lars Carlson Locke. Some of the Swedish were less than impressed with him, though. Maybe they just valued property more than patriotism, or maybe they had remembered that the various monarchs of Sweden had done bugger all for the colony for most of 3 decades. They vehemently opposed the Long Fin with every method at their disposal. In August 1669, they surprised Königsmark at one of his parties, heckled him, tried to trap him inside a cabin, and stabbed him with the knife as he fled. The wounded Königsmark was finally caught by English authorities on September 14th. He was identified as Marcus Jacobson, a runaway indentured servant from Maryland who was, quote,
so stupid that he could neither read nor write.
Jacobson was tried, convicted, whipped, and branded with an R for rebellion on his face and chest. And then for good measure, the English sold him into slavery in Barbados. When he was captured, Jacobson had several letters on him that made the English authorities see red. They revealed that Jacobson was just a figurehead, and that the real masterminds behind the rebellion were Prince and Locke. The duo were too well protected by their social prominence. If the English had arrested a Swedish noblewoman and a minister, the colony would have actually revolted. Rather than risk open rebellion, they hushed everything up. And that was the last time anyone thought about an independent New Sweden. In 1673, the Dutch briefly reconquered their lost colony, but the English got everything back a year later in the Treaty of Westminster. New Sweden continued to remain the personal property of the future James II, who leased it all to some guy named William Penn in 1682. Never heard of him. And that's the story of New Sweden. In most history books, the colony is just a footnote. Historians will tell you it had little impact at the time and no long-term effects on America other than a few Swedish place names and historic sites scattered across Delaware, Pennsylvania, and New Jersey. It's hard to argue with this viewpoint. At New Sweden's largest extent, it only had about 500 colonists. They were constantly outnumbered by the English and Dutch, and so they never managed to influence mainstream institutions and thought. It didn't help that the Swedish government's business plan was Step 1, start a colony, Step 3 is profit. No one involved with the project had any idea what they were doing, and it showed. Apologists will try to bolster New Sweden's reputation by rattling off a series of famous firsts. The first anti-slavery legislation in America, the first Lutheran church, the first written work in a Native American language, the first permanent European settlement in Pennsylvania. These are often overstated and feel a bit desperate. But maybe there's something to be said for New Sweden. A number of historians, most notably Terry Jordan, have argued that though the Swedes may have had little effect on our national history, they had a profound effect on our national character. Or rather, that the Finns did. Those forest-destroying Finns? They didn't stop at the borders of New Sweden. They kept pushing west into Maryland, Pennsylvania, Virginia, even Ohio. They took their culture with them, and it was a culture very well adapted for survival on the frontier. When the English finally moved out west to meet them, well, they adopted huge chunks of that culture for their own rather than reinvent the wheel. Most notably, that includes the good old-fashioned American log cabin. Now, lots of cultures make log cabins, but the most popular American design uses a V-shaped notch and a board roof, which are distinctly Finnish in origin. Over and above that, though, the Finns loved individualism and freedom of movement, hated the government and taxes, and were comfortable sharing space with people from other cultures. That's the core of the American frontier spirit right there. So it turns out that can-do American spirit? In many ways, it's a can-do Finnish spirit. And that's pretty Mahtava. Key sources for this episode include Terry G. Jordan and Matti Kapus's The American Backwoods Frontier, an Ethnic and Ecological Interpretation, J. Thomas Sharf's History of Delaware 1609 to 1888, George Sidney Fisher's The Making of Pennsylvania, and numerous articles in the Pennsylvania Magazine of History and Biography. Connections! Longtime listeners will know that this is hardly the first time we've talked about Scandinavians colonizing America. We talked about early Icelandic settler Thorfinn Karlsefni in Series 5's The Icelander, and spent 3 episodes at the end of Series 8 discussing the evidence, or lack thereof, for Viking settlement of North America in westward Huss. This is also not the first time we've talked about people from Connecticut trying to settle within the borders of Pennsylvania. For more about that, see last series, The War Between the States. The really striking photo that we're using for our cover art this week is of the Kalmar nickel. Now, the real Kalmar nickel is somewhere at the bottom of the sea, somewhere off the coast of Scotland. This Kalmar nickel is a replica built in 1997, and also the official tall ship of Delaware. If you like tall ships, and if you're listening to this podcast, there's a pretty good chance that you do, you owe it to yourself to go down to Wilmington and take a cruise on the Kalmar nickel. You won't regret it. That's all for now. Time for me to hop on that bike. Until next time, initiates, quicquid minime sciant, optime scire. This episode was written and produced by David White for the Ancient and Esoteric Order of the Jackalope and That's Not Canon Productions. Our theme song is Drama D by Scott Roosh. This episode is released under a Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial Share-alike 4.0 International License. All rights reserved, all wrongs reversed. The full script and sources for this episode can be found at orderthejackalope.com. That's orderthejackalope.com with hyphens between the words. Do you have thoughts about this episode? Why not share them on our Discord server? There's a link in the show notes. Or message us on social media. We can be found at orderjackalope. If social media isn't your thing, send us an email at jackalope@orderthejackalope.com. We're recruiting new lodge members. We'll initiate anyone into the secret mysteries. All they have to do is share a secret mystery of their own. Visit our website and click Join Us for more information.